There are two kinds of strength: the kind you flex when you lift something heavy, and the kind you find when everything else is taken away. The first is admired. The second is remembered. Angela Robinson learned the second kind at 52, when the casserole dishes stopped arriving and the sympathy cards thinned to a few tired envelopes on the mantel. The house smelled faintly of lilies and bleach, that odd after-scent of a life put in order for goodbye. The refrigerator hummed in a new, impatient way. Even the clock over the stove ticked louder, as if it had decided time would no longer tiptoe. "Mom," Jasmine's voice drifted from the hallway. 16 and trying to sound older, as teenagers do when childhood has been interrupted. "They're asking if we want the wheelchair picked up or if we're donating it." "Donate," Angela said, then caught the word like a cough in her throat. She had learned to speak in small syllables since the hospital because big ones broke midair and fell hard. Cancer is a thief that steals in installments. First the appetite, then the color, then the ease of sleep, then dignity, and at last the breath. For 18 months, Angela had measured life in pill organizers and lab numbers. Some days, her husband, Leonard, smiled at her like a man still building an addition to the future. Other days, he looked across the room as if slanting sunlight were some old photograph of the life they had meant to keep. He had been a school bus mechanic for 24 years. His hands were the color of walnuts and always smelled faintly of a clean garage, oil, soap, and cold air. On good mornings, he could still make Jasmine laugh with riddles he'd learned from second graders. On the best ones, he'd sit with Marcus, their 19-year-old, trying to untangle FAFSA forms and auto insurance like two men fixing an engine with too many wires. The morning Leonard died, rain draped the windows in long gray beads. The nurse was kind. The machines went quiet one by one, like polite guests leaving a too-long party. Angela made the strangest sound and then didn't make any sound at all. People say, "Call me if you need anything," the way you might say, "bless you," after a sneeze. They mean it, but there is no phone with a button labeled anything. What you need is to get out of bed when your body has convinced itself there is no good reason to. What you need is to eat half a sandwich. What you need is to keep your children from believing grief is a room with no doors. Funerals are expensive even when they are modest. Angela learned this at the table where the funeral director slid papers toward her like menus. She chose the less costly casket, the shorter visitation, and a flower arrangement that made the church look respectful rather than extravagant. She wrote a check and felt something behind her ribs recoil like a startled bird. Later, she'd stand in the kitchen with a calculator and a yellow legal pad and write the word mortgage as if it were a person she could negotiate with. "Mom," the school emailed again, Marcus said that week, holding out his phone like it might bite. He deferred his second semester at community college, promising he'd go back in the fall. Promises are easy when you're 20 and the world still looks like wet cement, ready for your initials. "They need the payment by the 15th. I can pick up more shifts at the shop," but he did not finish. He did not need to. Angela nodded. She had taken a second job before Leonard's last month, overnights with an elderly widow who liked to talk to the photographs on her dresser. In the mornings, Angela would drive home, wake Jasmine, and pour cereal with hands that trembled from too much coffee and not enough sleep. She told herself this was temporary the way people tell themselves winter is temporary, though the cold always feels personal when the wind finds the hole in your coat. The insurance claim arrived like a math problem answered in red ink. Denied, a technicality in a policy written in a dialect no human heart speaks. The savings evaporated faster than she imagined money could move. Co-pays, the ambulance, the quiet invoices that arrive in white envelopes marked "statement enclosed," as if shame were a medical procedure. At church, people hugged her the way you hug a jar you're afraid to drop. In the grocery store, Friends turned into meteorologists, talking about whether when what they wanted to say was, "We love you," and "How will you manage?" The answer to both was, "I'm trying." Angela had a talent for invisibility when it helped her children. She could be the coat nobody noticed hanging on the back of a chair. She could be the car idling in the school pickup lane, humming a hymn under her breath to ward off the fact that gas had gone up 30 cents. She had once wanted to finish her associate degree in medical billing. Life had, as they say, other plans, the way a rip current has plans for your ankles. One afternoon 2 weeks after the funeral, a man in a Navy windbreaker walked up the driveway holding a clipboard. He had the kindly voice of someone trained to sound friendly just before asking for something you don't have. "Mrs. Robinson," he said. "MS," she corrected, surprised at herself. Widowhood had edited her. "I'm with Monarch Mortgage Services." He cleared his throat. "We're following up on the forbearance period, which, unfortunately, has expired. We sent notices." "We got them," she said. She could picture the stack, rubber-banded, on the kitchen table. "I'm sorry to do this now," he added, eyes wandering to the play of dust in the porch light. "We'll need a payment by the end of the month to avoid further action." Further action, a phrase that sounds like a polite way to say hurricane. When he left, Angela sat on the step and watched the last of the daylight slide between the maple branches. Jasmine came out and tucked herself against her mother's shoulder. The girl had been spending more time in her room, headphones on, curating playlists that sounded like rain trying to talk. You learn a lot about your child by the volume at which they live after a loss. "Are we okay?" Jasmine asked, the question children practice on their parents like a spell. "We're together," Angela said. It was both the fullest and the truest answer she had. The next morning, the mailbox offered nothing but a coupon for pizza and an envelope from the hospital. The pizza coupon felt like a joke delivered by the universe with poor timing. She tucked it into the junk drawer anyway. Miracles come in cheap cardboard sometimes. By the third week, the warning notices grew teeth. Words like delinquent and default snapped at her ankles. She called the bank and spoke to a woman named Denise who had the voice of someone who remembers birthdays. They worked through options the way two people scrape the last spoonfuls from a jar, hopeful but realistic about what remains. In the end, the math had no extra chairs for Grace to sit in. At night, Angela dreamed of Leonard sitting at the kitchen table, tapping a pen against a coffee mug in that absent way he had when he was solving a problem. In the dream, he looked up and said, "Angie, you're stronger than the worst day." She woke with the line tangled in her chest like a kite string. Marcus grew quiet in the way young men do when they are trying to be the noise of bravery. He fixed a leak under the sink and then called a friend about extra hours. He texted less. He stood in the doorway of his sister's room more often, a sentry in sweatpants and a work shirt, and said things like, "You good?" Doing is easier than feeling when your hands know wrenches. A week before the end of the month, a certified letter arrived. The envelope was thick, the kind of thick that means something official has decided to do without you. Angela read it standing by the stove. She read it again at the table. She sat, because sitting is what we do when a word like foreclosure walks into the room and takes its hat off. She called Denise. She called her sister in Ohio and let the call go to voicemail. She called the pastor who offered prayers and a list of community resources and the names of 2 congregants who owned rental properties. She made a list of every item in the house that could be sold and realized objects tell the truth about our priorities. The couch with its coffee stain, the lamp from a yard sale, the wedding photo that no one would buy but everyone would notice was missing. On Friday, they packed. The house sounded wrong with drawers opening and closing, wrong with the scrape of boxes over hardwood. Jasmine labeled things with a Sharpie, kitchen, books, keep. Marcus carried a dresser to the curb and was halfway back up the walkway when he stopped and looked at the front window. The afternoon sun laid itself across the glass like a blessing that had arrived one day too late. "Where are we going?" Jasmine asked. Angela had found a listing pinned to a bulletin board at the community center, a two-bedroom on the east side, near the elevated tracks, cozy. The ad promised, a word that means small if you are optimistic and cramped if you are tired. The landlord wanted first month, last month, and proof of income. She had the first month, a note from Denise, and a face practiced at asking for mercy without appearing to beg. "The Baldwin Apartments," Angela said. "It's older, but it'll be ours for now." They drove at dusk, the car stuffed in that embarrassing way that makes lane changes feel like decisions about fate. The neighborhood changed block by block. The lawns thinned. Porches grew crowded with plastic chairs. A mural bloomed on a brick wall, brown hands lifting a city skyline like a loaf of bread. The Baldwin was a tired building that tried not to look it. "A for rent" sign hung in the front window at a tilt, as if even it were leaning on something. The hallway smelled like last night's dinner and bleach. The elevator worked if you asked nicely. Their new apartment had a kitchen the size of a generous closet and a window that overlooked the alley. Someone had left a potted plant on the fire escape, an anemic ivy that still reached for light, which struck Angela as either brave or stubborn, maybe both. When the kids carried in the last box, Angela stood alone in the middle of the living room and listened to the new quiet. The old house had remembered them, the way she hummed when she folded towels, the way Leonard whistled, "Ain't No Sunshine," off-key and cheerful while making pancakes. This place did not know them yet. It would have to learn. On the wall, faint squares marked where someone else's pictures had once hung. Angela pressed her palm to one, the way you might test the temperature of bathwater. She thought of the lesson no one asks to learn, that home is not walls and mortgage statements. It is the courage to carry your people, even when your hands shake. A siren wailed a few blocks over. The train rattled past like a long breath being let out. Jasmine unpacked a photo of Leonard and set it on the windowsill. Marcus sat on the floor and leaned back against a box labeled Dad's Tools. Angela opened the pizza coupon and for once allowed the universe its small mercy. They ate on the floor, paper plates balanced on their knees. Jasmine giggled at something on her phone and passed it to Marcus. He smirked, the first smile Angela had seen that reached all the way to his eyes. It lasted a second. It was enough. "Tomorrow," Angela said, more to herself than to them. "We'll find the grocery store. We'll figure out the bus line. She let the sentence trail off. Tomorrow is an honest promise when today has exhausted you." Outside, the streetlight flickered, testing its resolve against the dark. Inside, the three of them sat closer than the square footage required. This, Angela thought, is how a life re-begins, not with trumpets, but with boxes and a coupon and a decision that you will not let this be the last chapter. And then she heard it, the first soft sound of the future, which is simply the sound of your own breath when you realize you are still alive. Angela woke before the alarm, as she often did these days. It wasn't rest that had stirred her but the familiar ache of responsibility, the kind that pressed on her chest heavier than sleep. The Baldwin Apartments were quiet at 5 a.m., the kind of quiet that belonged more to exhaustion than peace. Somewhere down the hall, a baby whimpered, then hushed. Pipes groaned. Life here was always reminding you that someone else was also awake too early. She slid from the thin mattress and pulled on her uniform. Dark slacks, a faded polo with evergreen cleaning services stitched over the pocket. It wasn't the kind of job that made introductions easy at dinner parties, but Angela hadn't been invited to a dinner party in years. She worked mornings at the downtown office complex, scrubbing restrooms and wiping glass walls that reflected a world she no longer entered. At night, she cared for Mrs. Langston, an 84-year-old widow with fragile bones and a sharper memory than most. Her days were divided into segments of labor and worry, punctuated by the fear she was not enough for her children. When she returned from the morning shift, Marcus was already gone. He had left a note on the table written in his quick, impatient handwriting, "Extra hours at the shop. Don't wait for me." His pride was stitched into every letter. 19 was too young to bury your father and too old to collapse in your mother's arms, so he chose instead to stand taller than he felt, hiding grief under grease-stained hands. Jasmine sat at the small kitchen table, a geometry book spread open, her knees folded to her chest. Her hair was tied up messily, her face still swollen from the night before. "They posted the list for prom committee," she said without looking up. "I didn't even bother signing up." Angela rinsed her coffee mug, buying herself a moment. "Why not?" Jasmine shrugged. "What would I wear? You think we can afford a ticket? Everyone knows, Mom," they whisper. The words pierced deeper than the girl intended. In high school, reputation traveled faster than truth. Angela knew Jasmine carried the weight of their poverty like a second backpack, heavier than any textbook. "You are not your circumstances," Angela said gently, reaching for her daughter's hand. But Jasmine pulled away, staring hard at the numbers on the page, as if geometry could explain how to balance a life tilted by loss. That evening, Angela rode the bus across town to Mrs. Langston's narrow brick home. The old woman greeted her with suspicion, as always. "You're late." "It's 6:01, Angela replied softly. The bus ran behind. Mrs. Langston's eyes narrowed, but she said nothing more. Angela set about her routine, preparing tea, laying out pills, adjusting the blanket over thin legs. Caring for her reminded Angela of Leonard's last months, and some nights she had to steady her breath to keep memories from drowning her. Back at the apartment, Marcus was waiting. His arms were crossed, his jaw tense. "The shop's cutting hours, not enough cars coming in. I'll look for another job," but he broke off, rubbing his temples. "I should drop school, Mom, it's just more bills." Angela set down her bag and faced him. "No, your father wanted you in college. He worked nights so you wouldn't have to." "Well, look where that got him," Marcus muttered, instantly regretting the sting in his own words. He stormed off, leaving silence heavy in his wake. Angela sat in the dim kitchen long after, staring at the peeling paint near the ceiling. She knew what her children didn't. The rent was already overdue. Another letter had arrived that morning, folded and stiff with its warnings. The landlord was patient but not infinite. Soon, even this modest roof could vanish. She thought of the old house, the one with the porch swing and the maple tree out front. Gone now, swallowed by foreclosure, yet alive in every memory. In that house, Jasmine had taken her first steps, wobbling from Leonard's arms into hers. In that house, Marcus had stayed up late practicing guitar, plucking strings too loudly for neighbors, but just right for pride. Now they were here in Baldwin Apartments, where walls were thin and futures thinner. Angela rubbed her tired eyes. She had once dreamed of finishing her degree, maybe working at a clinic or hospital, helping families navigate their bills with dignity. Now her own life was a case study in exhaustion. Still, dawn would come again and she would rise. She always did. Because strength was no longer a choice, it was a currency, and her children's survival depended on her never running out. The Baldwin Apartments had a way of making privacy feel like a luxury. On Sunday mornings, when Angela tried to sleep past 7, she could still hear the neighbor's radio playing gospel 2 doors down. On Tuesday nights, the arguments from the couple across the hall bled through the plaster walls like an unwanted confession. By the end of her first month there, Angela understood why people kept their blinds closed but their ears open. It was Mrs. Johnson who embodied this truth most fully. She lived downstairs in a unit that smelled permanently of fried onions and lavender detergent. She was in her 60s, a widow herself, though the word sat differently on her shoulders. Where Angela carried hers quietly, Mrs. Johnson wore it like armor. She had lived long enough to make peace with her losses and to comment on everyone else's. "Angela Robinson," she said one afternoon, catching her at the mailboxes. "I heard your Marcus is looking for work again." Shame, a boy that age, already carrying the load his daddy should have left him. Angela stiffened, clutching the thin stack of envelopes, half bills, half advertisements she couldn't afford to care about. "He's a good boy," she answered simply. Mrs. Johnson squinted, her lips pursed in that way people do when they mistake gossip for wisdom. "Good boys don't pay rent. And Jasmine, she's what, 16 now? Lord help you. Girls at that age either study their way out or fall into trouble fast. And trouble's always knocking loudest in buildings like this." Angela felt her throat tighten. She wanted to defend her children, to remind Mrs. Johnson that Marcus still dreamed of college and Jasmine was more than the whispers of classmates. But exhaustion tugged at her, and instead she forced a polite smile. "Thank you for your concern," she said, pushing past with dignity that cost her more than the overdue gas bill in her purse. That night, Jasmine sat cross-legged on the narrow couch, scrolling through her phone with a face that was equal parts boredom and hurt. Angela sat across from her, folding laundry by lamplight. "They said something about me again today," Jasmine muttered, not looking up. Angela's hands paused over a towel. "Who did?" "Everybody." Jasmine's voice cracked with the sharpness only a teenager can conjure. "They know Dad's gone. They know we moved here. They say things like welfare princess and laugh when I walk by. It's like I'm contaminated or something." Angela set the towel aside, reached across the small table, and touched her daughter's hand. "You are not defined by what people say in hallways. Their words don't decide your worth." Jasmine pulled her hand back, shaking her head. "Easy for you to say. You don't sit in that cafeteria." Angela swallowed hard. She thought of her own cafeteria years, the way kids whispered about the girl with the wrong shoes. Some cruelties age out, others evolve and persist. She wished she had the power to silence them, to pull Jasmine out of that world and place her somewhere safer, somewhere kinder. Instead, she had only words, and lately, words felt like buckets tossed into a well that kept going deeper. Later that week, Marcus came home with grease under his nails and a shadow across his face. He dropped his jacket on a chair and muttered, "Shop cut my hours again. They don't need part-time when business is slow." Angela watched him pace. He was 19, tall like his father, with that same restless energy that made standing still seem impossible. But where Leonard's restlessness had been softened by time, Marcus's burned hot and impatient. "I'll pick up another job," Angela said. "We'll manage." Marcus stopped, turned, and for the first time his anger wasn't at the world but at her. "Why do you always say that? We'll manage. We're not managing, Mom. We're drowning. You're working yourself into the ground. Jasmine's miserable, and I'm spinning my wheels at a dead-end shop. This," he gestured around the cramped apartment, "this isn't living." The words cut because they were true, but Angela also knew that truth spoken without tenderness could wound deeper than lies. She took a steadying breath. "I know it's hard, harder than it should be, but we still have each other. That counts for more than you think." Marcus shook his head, muttering under his breath as he retreated to his room, the door shutting with a hollow thud. That night, Angela lay awake listening to the muffled city sounds through the cracked window. Sirens in the distance, the low rumble of a passing train, a neighbor's television laugh track rising too loud. She thought about Mrs. Johnson's sharp words, Jasmine's wounded eyes, Marcus's clenched jaw. Each of them carried grief differently, but all of them carried it heavy. She closed her eyes and whispered a prayer, not the kind she used to say in church, polished, memorized, but a simple plea breathed into the dark. Lord, show me how to keep them whole. Show me where the door is when all I see are walls. Morning came as it always did, indifferent to prayers. Angela rose, tied her hair back, and prepared for another day of scrubbing offices that didn't belong to her. But as she pulled on her uniform, she felt something shift inside. It wasn't hope exactly. More like defiance, the quiet, stubborn belief that even if the world dismissed her, she would not dismiss herself. And maybe, just maybe, that would be enough to keep her children from believing the whispers. Angela never liked working Saturdays. Downtown offices were mostly empty, the silence echoing through marble lobbies and glass corridors. The air smelled faintly of polish and recycled ventilation. She often hummed old hymns under her breath just to keep the loneliness from settling too deep in her bones. That morning, she'd been assigned a new location, a mansion on the north side of town, 3 stories of stone and glass set back behind iron gates. Special client, her supervisor had said, raising his eyebrows in a way that meant don't screw this up. Angela arrived with her supplies and stood in the driveway, staring at the house that looked more like a magazine spread than something people actually lived in. The windows were taller than her old living room ceiling. The lawn was clipped so perfectly, it seemed artificial. For a moment, she felt the ache of envy, then quickly scolded herself. Envy was wasted energy. Survival didn't leave room for it. The front door opened before she could knock. A tall man, late 50s perhaps, silver hair brushed neatly back, wearing a pressed shirt without a tie. He carried himself like someone used to being listened to. "You must be a mess. Robinson," he said, voice low and measured. "Yes, sir. Angela," she corrected softly. "David Harrison," he introduced, extending a hand. His grip was warm, firm. "Come in. The study and living areas need attention. My assistant usually handles these things, but she's been out sick. Thought I'd call in the professionals." Angela nodded, setting down her supplies, but inside she felt the old sting, professionals. People like her were often called that as a polite veil over the help. She knew her place in houses like this, invisible until needed, gone before remembered. Still, she worked carefully, dusting the heavy mahogany shelves in the study, polishing the marble counters in the kitchen, scrubbing until her knuckles turned red. When she passed through the living room, she noticed photos on the mantel. A younger David with a woman smiling brightly at his side, 2 children frozen in graduation gowns. Angela recognized the expression in his eyes, even across glass, loss that no frame could soften. As she wiped the table, she heard footsteps behind her. "You've done this before," David said, not as a question but as an observation. "Plenty of times," Angela replied. He studied her for a moment, then asked, "You have family?" Angela hesitated. This wasn't the kind of conversation she was used to having on a job. 2 kids, Marcus and Jasmine, teenagers. His eyebrows lifted. That's a full-time job in itself. Angela smiled faintly. "Feels like 3. Something flickered in his face, a trace of memory. "I remember those years. My son tested every boundary in the book. My daughter thought the world revolved around her. Their mother kept us all steady. God, she was the anchor." His voice trailed, and Angela didn't pry. Some wounds announced themselves without needing explanation. She finished her work and packed up quietly, eager to slip out without overstaying her welcome. But as she reached the door, David spoke again. "Angela," she turned. "I overheard your phone earlier. Something about tuition?" His tone was careful, respectful, but curious. Angela flushed. She'd taken a call from Jasmine's school while wiping counters. They'd warned about overdue fees for extracurriculars, hinting at possible suspension from activities if payment wasn't made. Angela had murmured reassurances she wasn't sure she could keep. "I'm sorry you heard that," she said, her voice low. "It's just, things have been difficult since my husband passed." David's expression softened. I understand. Believe me, I do. He reached for his wallet almost impulsively, then paused, reconsidering. Instead, he pulled out a business card and handed it to her. If you ever need something, odd jobs, part-time work, call me directly. My household always needs tending, and kids should never lose opportunities because of money. If I can help, I'd like to. Angela froze, card in hand. Part of her wanted to thank him, to cling to the lifeline. Another part bristled, pride, or maybe fear of dependence. She had lived too long under the weight of pity disguised as generosity. I appreciate it, she said cautiously, but I'm used to figuring things out on my own. David smiled gently. Strength is admirable, but even strong people deserve a hand once in a while. Keep the card. When she stepped back onto the driveway, sunlight catching the windows like fire, Angela felt something stir inside her. It wasn't quite hope, not yet, but it was the memory of how hope once felt before grief had hollowed it out. That night, over leftover pasta in their cramped kitchen, Jasmine sighed about her classmates. Marcus sat silent, scrolling his phone, jaw set in its usual tightness. Angela slipped the card into her purse, saying nothing. But later, when the apartment had gone quiet, she took it out again, tracing the embossed letters with her thumb. David Harrison, a name heavy with power, maybe possibility. She whispered to herself, almost as if confessing, maybe doors don't always stay closed. The card stayed in Angela's purse for days, tucked between expired coupons and the folded bills she counted every night. She told herself she wouldn't call. Pride was stubborn, and so was fear. The fear that accepting help meant she was weaker than she already felt. Still, every time Jasmine sighed about her future or Marcus came home with that look of quiet defeat, the card pulsed in her mind like a hidden ember. The breaking point came on a Thursday afternoon when Jasmine tossed her backpack onto the couch with unusual force. "Mom," she said flatly, "they're going to cut me from the track team if I don't pay the fees by Friday." Angela paused, wooden spoon in hand, stirring the same pot of beans they'd been stretching all week. "How much?" she asked, though she dreaded the answer. $85. To a man like David Harrison, that was pocket change. To Angela, it was 2 bus passes, a week's groceries, the last thread holding her dignity together. She set the spoon down, trying to measure her words. "Jas, I don't want you to worry. I'll figure something out." But Jasmine saw through her. "You always say that, Mom, but maybe you can't, not this time." Her eyes glistened, not with anger, but with the sharp ache of a teenager watching the world close doors before she even had the chance to knock. That night, long after the kids had gone to bed, Angela sat at the small kitchen table. She stared at the card again, tracing the raised letters. David Harrison. She whispered a prayer for courage, then dialed. The phone rang twice. "Angela?" His voice was calm, almost as if he'd been expecting her. "Mr. Harrison, She stopped, cleared her throat. "I didn't mean to bother you, you mentioned work. If there's anything I can do, I'll take it." There was a pause, then warmth in his reply. "I'm glad you called. I actually could use some help this weekend. My gardener's out for surgery and the property needs tending before an event. Nothing glamorous, but it pays better than most cleaning gigs. Would you be available?" Angela gripped the phone tighter. "Yes, absolutely, thank you." When Saturday came, she borrowed Marcus's work gloves and rode the bus across town again. The mansion looked even larger under spring sunlight, its manicured lawn already threatening to burst into weeds without care. David met her at the gate, sleeves rolled up, ready to work beside her. That surprised her. Men of his stature didn't usually sweat under the same sun as the people they hired. Together they trimmed hedges, pulled weeds, raked leaves into neat piles. At first, Angela moved quickly, determined to earn every penny, but David slowed the pace, insisting she take breaks. They talked in fragments about her kids, about his grown children who rarely visited, about the strange way loss remakes a person. You don't realize how much you leaned on someone, David said quietly, wiping his brow, until you reach for them and they're not there. Angela looked up, meeting his eyes. For the first time in a long time, she felt recognized, not as the help, not as a struggling widow, but as someone standing in the same storm. By late afternoon, the yard looked immaculate. David handed her an envelope with more bills than she expected. She tried to refuse part of it. "This is too much," she said. He shook his head. "It's exactly right. You worked hard. And your daughter, what's her name, Jasmine? Tell her to stay on that track team. She belongs there." Angela blinked back tears. She hadn't told him why she'd called, yet somehow he'd known. That evening, when Jasmine came home from a study session, Angela handed her the check for the school fees. Jasmine's eyes widened. "Mom, how?" "Don't worry about that," Angela said softly. "Just run. Run like you're running towards something, not away from it." For the first time in weeks, Jasmine smiled fully, the kind of smile that didn't look forced. Marcus watched quietly from the doorway, arms folded, expression unreadable. Later, when Angela was alone, she thought about the day, about the sunlight on David's silver hair, about the way he spoke not with pity but with understanding. It unsettled her, this flicker of warmth, because warmth had a way of melting walls, and she had built hers high. Still, as she lay in bed, listening to the city hum outside, Angela allowed herself one fragile thought. Maybe, just maybe, they weren't as alone as she'd believed. Marcus had been watching. Angela could feel it in the quiet weight of his gaze every time she mentioned David Harrison's name, even in passing. He didn't ask questions outright, not yet, but his silence carried the sharpness of accusation. The tension surfaced one evening when Jasmine burst into the kitchen, flushed with joy. "Mom, guess what? I qualified for the regional meet. Coach says I'm one of the fastest in the district." She dropped her backpack, bouncing on her toes. "This could get me noticed for scholarships." Angela clapped her hands, her heart swelling. "Oh, Jasmine, that's wonderful. I knew you had it in you." But Marcus, leaning against the doorway, muttered, "Yeah, thanks to Mr. Moneybags." The room went still. Jasmine froze, her excitement dimming like a light switched off. Angela's hands trembled around the dish towel. "Marcus," she said carefully. He stepped forward, jaw tight. "Let's not pretend, Mom. Her fees didn't get paid because you suddenly found magic money. It's because of him, the rich guy with the mansion." "His name is Mr. Harrison," Angela replied, voice steady but firm. "He offered work. I did the work, that's all." Marcus shook his head, bitterness pooling in his tone. "That's not all. People like him don't just help for no reason. They want something back. And meanwhile, you're teaching Jas that when you're broke, you just wait for some savior to come along." "Stop it," Jasmine snapped, eyes flashing. "Coach doesn't care who paid my fees. I earned that spot. You think I'm just charity?" "That's not what Marcus started, but Angela cut him off. "Enough," she said sharply. The authority in her voice startled even her. "We will not tear each other down in this house, not after everything we've already lost." Marcus pressed his lips into a thin line, grabbed his jacket, and stormed out. The door slammed so hard the picture frame on the wall rattled. Jasmine's shoulders slumped, the joy drained out of her. She whispered, "Why does he hate me?" Angela pulled her daughter close. "He doesn't hate you. He's angry. He's hurting. We all are." But inside, Angela feared Marcus's anger was less about grief and more about pride, the heavy kind that could fracture a family. That night, Marcus didn't come home. Angela sat at the table, phone in hand, staring at the clock. Midnight came, then 1 a.m. Her heart pounded with every creak in the hallway. She dialed his number. It rang and rang. Finally, at 2 in the morning, the door clicked open. Marcus walked in, smelling faintly of cigarettes and gasoline. His eyes were bloodshot, but not from drink. Angela knew that look. It was from trying too hard to hold himself together. "Where were you?" she whispered, relief and fury tangled in her throat. "Nowhere," he muttered, heading for his room. "Marcus, look at me." He stopped, shoulders sagging, but didn't turn. I don't want him in our lives, Mom. Not like this. We can make it without him. I'll find a way. Angela wanted to tell him she believed him. She wanted to promise that they could manage alone, that her strength was enough. But she remembered the envelope of bills David had placed in her hands, the way Jasmine's eyes had lit up when she talked about scholarships, the way the rent notices on the counter glared at her like open wounds. She couldn't lie. Not tonight. Instead, she said softly, "Marcus, I'm not looking for a savior. I'm just looking for a chance. For you, for Jasmine. And if someone is willing to open a door, I won't let pride stop me from walking through it." For a long moment, he stood in the doorway, his back to her. Finally, he muttered, "Pride's all I've got left," before disappearing into his room. Angela sat alone in the kitchen, the hum of the refrigerator filling the silence. She knew families broke not just from poverty, but from the fractures pride could carve. She prayed the cracks in her own house would not widen beyond repair. The next morning, when she left for work, the sun was rising pale and weak over the city. She clutched her bag close, David's card still tucked inside, and whispered the same plea she had whispered every day since Leonard's death. "Lord, keep us together, even when we're falling apart." Angela didn't see David again for nearly 2 weeks. Life swept her into its routine of buses, mops, and late nights with Mrs. Langston. She tried to keep her mind fixed on the immediate, stretching groceries, making sure Jasmine had shoes good enough for her next meet, watching Marcus's face for signs of deeper trouble. But David's card still sat in her purse like a stone, heavy with unspoken possibility. One rainy evening, while scrubbing the tiled floors of a law firm downtown, her phone buzzed, unknown number. She almost ignored it, then answered. "Angela?" It was David's voice, calm and steady. "I hope I'm not calling too late." She glanced at the clock, 9:14 p.m. "It's fine," she said, her voice cautious. "I've been thinking. My assistant won't be back for a while. The house needs regular care. If you're interested, I'd like to hire you directly on top of what you're doing now. Flexible hours, fair pay." Angela tightened her grip on the mop handle. She could already hear Marcus's voice in her head, "See, he wants to buy us." But then she thought of the rent notice still folded in her jacket pocket. "I'll think about it," she said carefully. When she told Marcus the next morning, his jaw clenched. "Of course he wants you there more. Rich men don't do anything for free, Mom." "It's honest work," Angela replied, trying to keep her tone even. "Nothing more." "Nothing more yet," Marcus shot back. He grabbed his backpack and slammed the door behind him. Jasmine, watching from the table, muttered, "He needs to get over himself." Angela sighed. Pride and gratitude were colliding inside her home like two storms meeting in the sky. That weekend, Angela accepted David's offer. She arrived at the mansion on a crisp Saturday morning, the air sharp with the smell of wet grass. David greeted her with his usual courtesy, then surprised her by saying, "You don't need to clean today. Come, I want to show you something." He led her down a long hallway to a room she hadn't seen before, a study with tall windows and shelves lined with photographs. He picked up a frame, a woman smiling in a summer dress, hair caught in mid-laughter. "My wife, Claire," he said softly. "She passed 5 years ago, breast cancer. She was everything, kept me grounded, reminded me not to believe my own press." His chuckle was dry, tinged with sorrow. "I was lost after she died. Money doesn't fill the kind of hole grief digs." Angela's breath caught. She hadn't expected this kind of honesty, not from him. "I know what it is to lose the person who steadied you," she whispered. For a moment, the silence between them wasn't awkward. It was shared, like two people standing at the edge of the same river, watching the current carry away what they loved. David set the photo down. "I'm telling you this because I don't want you to think my help is charity. It's not. When I see you, Angela, I see someone still fighting, and I remember what it felt like when someone believed I could stand again." Angela blinked back sudden tears. She hadn't expected kindness to sound so familiar. That night, she returned home to Baldwin Apartments with a small envelope of cash and groceries David insisted she take. She placed the bag on the counter. Jasmine peeked inside, eyes wide. "Mom, real bread, not the store brand, and fresh strawberries?" Angela smiled weakly. "A gift." Marcus emerged from his room, saw the bag, and froze. From him, Angela's silence was answer enough. Marcus slammed his fist lightly against the doorframe. "This is exactly what I meant. He's sliding into our lives. First the yard, now groceries. What's next? Paying our rent, buying us?" "Marcus." "No, Mom," he snapped. His voice cracked, boyish beneath the anger. "I'm not gonna stand here and watch some stranger replace Dad." The word struck like a blow. Angela opened her mouth, then closed it again. There was no simple answer. David wasn't replacing Leonard. He couldn't, but Marcus's fear was real and it burned deep. That night, after her children had gone quiet, Angela sat on the edge of her bed with Leonard's photo in her lap. She whispered to it like a prayer. "I don't know if I'm failing them or saving them." Outside, the city hummed. Inside, Angela felt the weight of two truths colliding. Her children needed her steady, but the world had made her bend. And in the shadow of loss, even kindness carried consequences. The following week began with whispers that traveled faster than wind. At church on Sunday, Angela noticed the looks first, sideways glances, half-hidden smirks. Women she'd known for years leaned close to one another, voices dropping just as she passed. By the time she reached the fellowship hall for coffee, the words found her ears. "They say she's working for that Harrison man." Imagine, 52, already letting another man step in. Some widows move on quick when there's money involved. Angela's stomach clenched. She wanted to spin around to tell them the truth, that she was scrubbing his floors, not sharing his bed, but she kept her eyes forward. Pride was one thing, dignity was another. Jasmine wasn't as composed. That evening, she threw her bag onto the kitchen floor. "Mom, kids at school are saying you're with Mr. Harrison. They laughed at me in the hallway. Do you know how humiliating that is?" Angela felt the blood rush to her face. "It's gossip, Jasmine. People talk when they don't understand." "Well, it hurts," Jasmine snapped. "I don't want his help if it means everyone thinks we're some charity case or worse." The words sliced through Angela's chest. She'd taken the job to protect Jasmine's future, and here it was turned into ammunition against her own child. Marcus, overhearing from the doorway, let out a bitter laugh. "See, I told you. Nothing in this world comes for free." "Marcus," Angela said, her voice sharp, "that's enough." But Marcus wouldn't let it go. "No, Mom, you're letting him into our lives, and now Jas is paying the price. You keep saying it's just work, but everyone else knows better. You're letting him own us piece by piece." The room pulsed with silence. Jasmine's eyes brimmed with tears. Angela pressed her palm to her forehead. The walls of the small apartment felt tighter than ever, as if the air itself had turned against her. That night, Marcus didn't come home again. Jasmine locked herself in her room, muffled music leaking through the thin walls. Angela sat at the kitchen table staring at the rent notice, the red stamp glaring like a wound. 2 days later, the storm reached its peak. Angela was leaving David's mansion after a long day of cleaning when she spotted a familiar face at the gate. Mrs. Johnson, her downstairs neighbor, arms crossed, eyes sharp. Well, Mrs. Johnson said, "I wondered why you've been coming out this way. I should have guessed." Angela tightened her grip on her bag. "I'm working here, that's all." MMH. Mrs. Johnson's gaze swept her up and down. "Funny how folks always say just working when the man's got more money than God. Careful, Angela. People already talking. Don't let your kids pay for choices you can't take back." Angela walked past without replying, but the words clung to her like burrs. That evening, the apartment erupted. Marcus returned home to find the bag of groceries David had given her earlier in the week: fresh fruit, real milk, cuts of meat they hadn't had in months. He yanked the bag off the counter, slammed it down, and shouted, "What is this, Mom? His food, his pity." "Stop it," Jasmine cried. "We need this, I need this." "You don't get it," Marcus barked back. "Once you depend on a man like that, you never get free." "Dad's gone," Jasmine screamed, her voice cracking. "He's not coming back. Why can't you see Mom's just trying to keep us alive?" The words stunned the room into silence. Marcus's face paled, his lips trembling with the force of something he couldn't say. He shoved his chair back, retreating to his room with a slam. Jasmine burst into tears and fled to hers. Angela stood frozen in the middle of the kitchen, her heart pounding like a drum. She wanted to chase after them both, to hold them, to make them understand, but her legs wouldn't move. The storm had swallowed her family whole, and all she could do was pray they'd find their way back to her when the thunder passed. That night, she lay awake listening to the building groan around her, the pipes clanking, the baby crying down the hall, the hum of traffic outside. She realized then that survival was more than rent and groceries. Survival was keeping love alive when bitterness tried to drown it. And right now, her family's love was hanging by a thread. The shouting match in the apartment had left its scar. For days afterward, Angela felt her children moving around her like planets on different orbits, never crossing paths. Jasmine spent more time at the library, pretending she was buried in homework. Marcus vanished after work shifts, coming home late with the smell of gasoline and smoke clinging to his clothes. And Angela, she went on as always, carrying groceries up the cracked stairwell, scrubbing other people's kitchens, praying silently on buses. But silence can be more dangerous than words. One Friday evening, just after sunset, the phone rang. Angela almost didn't answer. It was an unfamiliar number. When she did, a flat voice spoke. "Mrs. Robinson, this is Officer Delaney with the precinct. Your son Marcus is here." Her heart plummeted. Did something happen? He was involved in a fight outside a convenience store. Nobody's seriously hurt, but he's being held for disturbing the peace. You'll need to come down. Angela's knees weakened. She pressed a hand to the wall to steady herself. Jasmine emerged from her room, eyes wide. "What happened?" "Your brother," Angela whispered. She grabbed her coat, her purse, and left before her legs could betray her. At the precinct, Marcus sat slouched in a plastic chair, a bruise forming along his jaw. His hands were shoved deep into his hoodie pocket, his eyes fixed on the floor. When he saw her, he didn't smile, didn't speak. Officer Delaney explained. Marcus had stepped between two boys who were taunting a younger kid, then things escalated. A punch, then another. By the time the officers arrived, Marcus had bloodied his knuckles and a reputation to match. Angela listened, her chest tightening. She wanted to be proud that he'd tried to defend someone weaker. But all the officer saw was another young black man in the wrong place, throwing fists. The fine for his release was more than Angela had in her wallet. She thought of calling her sister in Ohio, but shame silenced her. Then she thought of David. The thought itself burned her throat. She didn't want to, she shouldn't, but Marcus's eyes, tired, angry, too much like Leonard's when cornered, pushed her past pride. When she stepped outside, rain slicked the pavement. Her fingers trembled as she dialed the number she swore she wouldn't. "Angela?" David's voice was low, steady. She closed her eyes. "I need help. Marcus, he's at the precinct. I can't cover the fine. I don't know what else to do." There was no pause, no hesitation. "Text me the address, I'll be there." An hour later, Marcus walked out of the precinct, his hoodie pulled low, his expression stormy. David stood by Angela's side, papers folded neatly in his hand. He didn't gloat, didn't speak. He only nodded at Marcus and said, "You're free to go." Marcus's jaw tightened. "Thanks," he muttered, the word tasting like rust. The drive home was quiet. Jasmine, waiting at the apartment door, burst into tears when she saw her brother. Marcus let her hug him but kept his eyes fixed somewhere past Angela. Later that night, when the kids were asleep, Angela sat at the kitchen table across from David. The apartment felt too small for his presence, his clean suit, his quiet strength, the scent of leather and rain that clung to him. "I didn't want to call you," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know," he said gently, "but you did what you had to. That's what parents do." Angela dropped her gaze to the chipped tabletop. "Every time you step in, I feel like I'm losing something. My pride, my control, my place as their mother." David leaned forward, his voice steady. "Angela, accepting help doesn't make you less. It makes you human. And your children, they need you strong, not perfect." Her eyes stung. She wanted to believe him, but she also knew Marcus would see tonight as proof of everything he feared. Dependence, intrusion, a stranger replacing the father he'd lost. When David left, Angela stood by the window, watching his car disappear into the rain. She pressed her hand to the glass, whispering into the dark, "Leonard, I don't know if I'm failing them or saving them. Please give me a sign." Behind her, the apartment was still, except for the faint sound of Marcus's restless tossing in the next room. The floor beneath her feet felt fragile, as if one more storm might crack it wide open. The morning after the precinct ordeal, Angela felt the weight of defeat pressing harder than ever. She rose early, brewed coffee, and sat at the kitchen table staring at the steam rising from the chipped mug. Marcus was still asleep, his knuckles bandaged from the fight. Jasmine padded into the kitchen, her hair messy, her eyes wary. "Mom," she said softly, "are we okay?" Angela forced a smile she didn't feel. "We're breathing, that's enough for now." But inside, she knew breathing wasn't enough. They couldn't keep lurching from one crisis to the next. She needed more than survival, she needed stability. That week, an idea began to form, sparked by Mrs. Langston, the elderly widow Angela cared for at night. "You know, Mrs." Langston murmured as Angela adjusted her pillows, "you have a gift. Not everyone can make people feel safe. You could run circles around half the nursing aides I've met." Angela laughed softly, brushing off the compliment. But later, walking home under the orange glow of streetlights, the words echoed in her mind. A gift. Safe. Circles around the rest. What if her years of caregiving, Leonard, Mrs. Langston, the countless households she cleaned, weren't just survival? What if they were skills? By the time she reached Baldwin Apartments, the idea had bloomed: start a small in-home care service. Nothing grand. Just a way to use what she knew on her own terms. She tested the thought on Jasmine first. What if I offered home visits to families who need help with meals, errands, care? There are plenty of folks who can't afford full-time aides but still need a hand. Jasmine's face lit up. "Mom, that's actually brilliant. You'd be the boss. No more awful managers breathing down your neck." Marcus was harder. When she told him over dinner, he frowned. "Another job? You already work too. You'll burn out." "This wouldn't be just another job," Angela said, steady. "It would be mine, something I could grow." Marcus muttered, "With Harrison's money, I bet." Angela's fork froze midair. "No," she said firmly. "This would be ours, built from what we already have, built from me." He didn't answer, but she saw the flicker of doubt in his eyes give way, just barely, to something else. Maybe curiosity, maybe hope. Within days, Angela made flyers on the library computer. "Reliable home care by Angela Robinson." Cooking, errands, companionship, light medical support. References available. She printed 20, then walked the neighborhood taping them to bulletin boards and slipping them under church doors. The first call came from a retired teacher named Mrs. Patterson. Her daughter lived out of state, and she needed help twice a week with groceries and laundry. Angela accepted immediately. The second came from a man caring for his father with early dementia. Angela met with him in a cramped living room that smelled of books and old carpet. "I just need someone trustworthy," he said, tired lines etched into his face. Angela nodded, recognizing that fatigue in her bones. By the end of the month, she had 3 steady clients and enough income to cover rent without juggling as many cleaning shifts. But the real shift wasn't in her wallet, it was in her children. Jasmine came home from track practice one afternoon, eyes sparkling. "Coach says if I keep this up, I could qualify for scholarships." "Actual scholarships, Mom." Angela hugged her, breathing in the scent of sweat and sun and youth that still believed in tomorrow. Even Marcus softened. One evening, she found him sitting at the kitchen table, looking over her flyers. "These are decent," he admitted grudgingly. "But you should add a phone number in bold. People need to see it quick." Angela smiled. "You'll help me redesign them?" He shrugged, but she saw the corners of his mouth twitch upward. "Guess so." It wasn't easy. There were long nights, aching feet, the constant fear that it could all collapse. But for the first time since Leonard's death, Angela felt forward motion instead of just standing still. On a quiet Sunday morning, she sat with her children at church. Jasmine leaned against her shoulder, Marcus tapping his foot to the hymn. Angela whispered a prayer, not for rescue, not for miracles, but for endurance. She realized then that maybe David Harrison hadn't been a savior, but a spark. He'd reminded her that help didn't mean weakness, and that dignity could grow from opportunity. But the fire burning now, that was hers. As she walked home with Marcus and Jasmine at her side, the city's noise folding around them, Angela felt something she hadn't in years. The first fragile, stubborn shoots of hope breaking through cracked ground. And she promised herself she would not let them wither. By spring, Angela's days no longer felt like battles fought in the dark. They were still long, filled with errands, cooking, companionship for the elderly, and bookkeeping at night, but they carried a different rhythm now. Her small care service had grown. Word spread through the neighborhood, "Call Angela, she'll treat you like family." She kept a notebook on the kitchen counter, a record of every client and every payment, neat columns written in her careful hand. It wasn't much, but it was hers. And for the first time in years, her family didn't live on the edge of collapse. Jasmine thrived. At her regional track meet, Angela stood in the bleachers, heart pounding as her daughter raced down the lane. Jasmine crossed the finish line with arms outstretched, her face blazing with joy. Angela wept openly, not just for the medal, but for the girl who had finally learned to believe in herself again. Marcus took longer. He still bristled when David's name came up, still guarded his pride like a fragile treasure. But one night, Angela found him repairing her vacuum cleaner at the kitchen table, tools spread across the surface. "You don't have to fix everything," she teased. He looked up, half a smile tugging at his lips. "Maybe I do. Someone's gotta keep us running." Angela touched his shoulder, a silent thank you. She knew he was slowly learning what she herself had discovered. Fixing things wasn't about replacing the past, it was about keeping faith in the future. David remained present, though at a distance. He checked in sometimes, offering work or advice, but Angela kept her boundaries clear. Gratitude was one thing, dependency was another. They shared conversations about grief, about resilience, about the strangeness of starting over later in life. But Angela knew her story had to be written by her own hands, not borrowed ones. One Sunday evening after dinner, Angela sat with her children in their modest living room. Jasmine sprawled across the couch with her medal around her neck, humming softly. Marcus leaned against the window frame, arms crossed, eyes thoughtful but calm. Angela looked at them and felt something shift inside her. For so long, she had been consumed with the fear of losing them, to poverty, to bitterness, to despair. But here they were under the same roof, scarred yet standing, stitched together not by perfection but by persistence. She rose, retrieved Leonard's photo from the shelf, and placed it on the table. "We've come far," she whispered, almost to him. "We're not done, but we're standing." Jasmine looked up, her voice gentle. "Mom?" "Yes, baby. I think Dad would be proud." Angela's throat tightened. She glanced at Marcus, who gave a small nod, his silence carrying more weight than words. She realized then that the cracks in their family hadn't broken them. They had become the lines where light could enter. Later that night, when the city outside quieted and her children slept, Angela sat by the window with her journal. She wrote not of loss, but of growth, not of pity, but of strength. Her story was not one of rescue, but of rediscovery. And for the first time in a long time, she ended her entry with a sentence that rang true: "We are going to be okay." To everyone who has walked with me through Angela's story, thank you. May her struggles remind us that even in the darkest valleys, love can still find a way to bloom. I wish you health, strength, and happiness in your own families. Hold them close, cherish them always.